The words left her lips like a confession and a farewell all at once, her dark eyes glistening in the amber light of the kerosene lamp that hung crooked above the bar of the Silver Spur Saloon in Redemption, Texas, in the sweltering summer of 1882. "I'm not worth the trouble, Andrew," Marcella Reed said, and her voice was low and cracked at the edges, like old leather that had been soaked too many times in rain and left to dry in the merciless sun. "You need to understand that. Everything I touch either breaks or burns. I am a woman with a dark past trailing behind her like smoke, and any man who ties himself to me is choosing disaster over peace. So please, walk away while you still can. Walk away before my secrets become your ruin." Andrew Lockhart stood across from her, 6 feet of sunburned resolve in a faded denim shirt and worn leather boots, his jaw set like stone and his gray eyes burning with something that refused to be extinguished. He had a bullet graze along his left forearm, fresh and bandaged in torn cloth, from the ambush they had barely survived 2 hours ago on the Cimarron Road. His hat sat low on his brow, and he reached up slowly and took it off, setting it on the bar top with deliberate calm, the way a man sets down something precious before he says what cannot be unsaid. He looked at her for a long, stretched moment in which the piano player in the corner had stopped playing and the two remaining drunks at the far table had gone quiet, as if even they understood that something momentous was occurring in the dusty corner of this dying little town. "Trouble," Andrew said, his voice rough as gravel and warm as a banked fire, "is all I have time for, Marcella." She stared at him. He did not flinch. "I have ridden through every county in this territory looking for a reason to stay somewhere," he continued, stepping closer until only the width of a breath separated them. "And the moment I walked into Redemption and found you standing in the middle of a street argument with 3 armed men over a land deed that was not even yours to fight for, I knew I had found my reason. I am not walking away. Not from you. Not from whatever it is chasing you. We face it together or we face nothing." The look on her face was not the relief of a woman rescued. It was the terror of a woman who had finally been seen, and who did not yet know whether being seen would save her or destroy her. To understand how they arrived at this impossible, breathtaking, dangerous moment, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the week when Marcella Reed rode into Redemption with nothing but a forged letter, a stolen horse, and a name she had borrowed from a dead woman. It was the 3rd week of June, 1882, and the town of Redemption, Texas sat at the edge of nowhere like a fever dream, baking under a sun that showed no mercy. The Panhandle was dry that year, drier than anyone could recall, and the dust that rolled through the wide main street coated everything in a fine pale grit that settled into the cracks of wooden storefronts, into the wrinkles around the eyes of old men sitting on porches, and into the lungs of anyone foolish enough to be outside between noon and 3. Marcella had ridden for 2 days straight from Abilene with very little water and even less sleep, and when her stolen roan mare finally limped into Redemption, Marcella looked like a woman who had been wrung out and hung up to dry. She was 26 years old, with thick black hair that she wore in a braid down her back and dark brown eyes that missed nothing. She had high cheekbones and a mouth that might have been beautiful if it were not always pressed into a careful line of vigilance. She wore a gray linen dress that had once belonged to a saloon hostess in Abilene, and she carried a carpetbag that held 2 changes of clothing, a small Remington Derringer with 4 rounds left, and a ledger book filled with handwritten notes in a cipher she had invented herself. She tied the roan at the post outside the Redemption General Store and walked inside with the ease of a woman who had been performing confidence since she was 15 years old. The store was run by a stout, red-faced man named Gerald Potts who wore suspenders over a striped shirt and had the kind of mustache that curled upward at the ends through no deliberate intention. He looked her over with the measuring gaze that small-town men reserved for strangers and women traveling alone, and then he said, "Help you." "I am looking for the land registry office," Marcella said. I understand there is one here. Gerald Potts told her it was attached to the sheriff's office on the far end of the street, and that the man who kept the records was a Mr. Caleb Drew, who was also the deputy because Redemption had not had a full sheriff in 8 months. She thanked him and walked back into the heat. The land registry was a small, stuffy room with a wooden counter and shelves of leather-bound ledgers. Behind the counter sat a thin, pale man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. This was Caleb Drew, who looked at Marcella with the particular wariness of a man who had learned to be suspicious of charming strangers about 3 catastrophes too late. "I am here regarding the Reed homestead claim," Marcella said, setting the forged letter on the counter. "My name is Marcella Reed. My mother, Alina Reed, filed a homestead claim on 400 acres northeast of town in 1878 under the Homestead Act of 1862. She passed 8 months ago. I am her daughter and sole heir, and I have come to take possession of the property." Caleb Drew read the letter slowly. He read it again. He set it down and looked at her over the rims of his spectacles with eyes that were sharper than they first appeared. "This is notarized," he said. "Yes. In Abilene. Yes. By a Judge Harold P. Finch. That is correct." A pause. "Judge Finch passed away in April." Marcella did not blink. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. She said very calmly, "I know. I was notified by his office. The notarization was completed in February before his illness became critical. The document is fully valid." Drew looked at the letter again. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. "I will need to verify this," he said. "It may take some time." "Of course," Marcella said, and smiled. And the smile was so steady and warm that Drew found himself believing her in spite of himself. She had 3 days at most before anyone thought to wire Abilene for confirmation. In 3 days, she needed to find what she had come to Redemption for, and she needed to be gone before the trap she was walking into had time to spring shut. The hidden motive behind Marcella Reed's arrival in Redemption was not, in fact, the land claim. The land claim was a cover, a reason to be in town, a story to tell anyone who asked questions. The real reason she had come was a man named Virgil Crane. Virgil Crane was 44 years old and one of the most dangerous men in the Texas Panhandle, though he wore his danger in expensive clothes and behind a wide, easy smile. He ran a land acquisition company called Crane and Associates that operated out of a suite of rooms above the First Bank of Redemption, and he had been systematically buying, intimidating, forging, and forcing his way into ownership of nearly every viable piece of farmland and grazing range within 60 miles of the town. He had ruined families. He had burned barns. He had used hired men with guns to encourage landowners to sell at a fraction of what their property was worth, and when encouragement failed, those landowners had a way of encountering fatal accidents on lonely roads. 3 of those accidents had involved people Marcella knew. One of them was a man named Thomas Gaines, who had been her mother's common-law husband, a quiet, good-natured homesteader who had built something real on the Texas prairie, until Virgil Crane decided he wanted it. Thomas Gaines had died in October of 1881. The official account was that his wagon had overturned crossing a creek. The unofficial account, the one that Marcella had been piecing together for 8 months from testimony she had collected, letters she had intercepted, and records she had copied in 3 different county offices, was that Thomas had been murdered because he refused to sell, and because he had begun writing letters to the Texas Land Commission describing what Crane was doing. Marcella had those letters. She had copies of fraudulent deeds. She had a sworn statement from a former employee of Crane's, named Pete Dalloway, who had witnessed things he was trying to forget. And she had a contact in the state capitol at Austin, a reformist commissioner named Elias Vance, who had told her that if she could get the original Crane land ledger, the one Crane kept himself rather than allowing into any official record, then there was enough evidence to bring him before a federal court. That ledger was in the safe in Crane's office above the First Bank of Redemption. This was what Marcella was here for. Not love, not land. Justice, and the kind of dangerous, forbidden, high-wire act that required her to be three things at once: a grieving daughter, a convincing legal claimant, and a thief skilled enough to steal from one of the most ruthless men in Texas. She had almost no margin for error, and she was completely alone, or so she thought, until the afternoon of her second day in town. She had been standing in the street outside the land registry, reviewing her mental map of the bank's layout, which she had reconstructed from the description of a woman named Clara Hobbs who had once cleaned those offices, when three of Virgil Crane's hired men came out of the saloon and began moving toward her with the particular casual menace of men who had been paid to deliver a message. The message, as near as she could translate the body language, was, "We know who you are, and you should leave." The lead man was a thick-necked, red-haired fellow named Rooster, who had the kind of face that suggested he had been in many fights and had won most of them through sheer willingness to absorb punishment. He stepped into her path and crossed his arms and said, "Miss Reed, Mr. Crane would like a word with you." Marcella kept her expression pleasant and her hand nowhere near the derringer in her bag. "Mr. Crane may send a written invitation to the boarding house like a gentleman," she said. "I do not conduct business in the street." Rooster smiled. It was not a good smile. Mr. Crane don't usually give women the option of declining. The two men behind him spread out slightly, blocking angles of retreat, and Marcella felt the specific cold clarity that settled over her in dangerous moments, the state of focused calm that she had first developed as a 15-year-old girl, navigating the violent unpredictability of a household run by her father before she had run away from it, and that she had refined across years of surviving in situations where no one was coming to save her. She was calculating the options available to her, none of which were good, when a voice spoke from just behind her left shoulder. "This woman is with me." The voice was deep and unhurried, with a quality like a door being shut firmly but without anger. Marcella turned. Andrew Lockhart was leaning against the post of the general store's porch with the negligent ease of a man who had nothing particular to prove. He was broad-shouldered and lean, 31 years old, with gray eyes the color of a sky before rain and dark hair that needed cutting by about 3 weeks. He wore a marshal's badge, and she would learn later that this detail was crucial, but in that first moment what she registered most was not the badge. It was the way he looked at Rooster and his companions with the patient, unimpressed expression of a man who had seen worse and expected he would see worse again. Rooster looked at the badge. His eyes tightened. "Marshal," he said. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Andrew Lockhart," Andrew said, and now he straightened off the post with the slow, deliberate movement of a man making clear that he was not staying where he was by choice but by preference. "Out of the Austin field office. I would advise you and your colleagues to go back inside and finish whatever you were drinking, because this lady is not going anywhere with Virgil Crane unless she chooses to." A long, crackling silence, the kind that has weight. Then Rooster unfolded his arms and stepped back, and the two men behind him shifted away, and all three of them walked back into the Silver Spur with the stiff, preserved dignity of men who intend to report this and plan accordingly. Andrew turned to Marcella. She turned to him. "Marcella Reed," he said. It was not a question. Every nerve in her body fired at once. He knew her name. Not the name she had given Drought, not a name she had invented, her actual name. Which meant he knew who she was, and if he knew who she was, then he knew the forged letter was forged, and the entire cover she had built began crumbling in her mind like a sandcastle at high tide. "You know me," she said, keeping her voice even. "I know of you," he said. "Commissioner Vance in Austin told me you might be here. He asked me to make sure you stayed alive long enough to get what you came for." She stared at him for 3 full seconds before she spoke again. "Commissioner Vance sent a lawman." "He sent me," Andrew said, "which is not exactly the same thing. I have been investigating Virgil Crane on my own account for 6 months." What Vance did not know when he mentioned you to me was that our investigations are aimed at exactly the same target. So here we are. I work alone, Marcella said. You were about to be dragged into a room with Virgil Crane by 3 armed men, Andrew said, not unkindly. With respect, Miss Reed, working alone was not going especially well as of about 90 seconds ago. She wanted to argue with him. She could see the logic of his point perfectly clearly, and she resented it with a clarity that surprised her, because the resentment told her something about how long she had been carrying everything by herself, and how badly she had trained herself not to need anyone. "Fine," she said. "Walk with me, but I need to understand what you know and how much of it overlaps with what I have, and I need to know whether you can be trusted." "A fair requirement," Andrew said, falling into step beside her. "I can say the same about you." They walked to the far end of town where a dry creek bed carved a shallow arc through the scrub, and they sat on the crumbling bank in the shade of a cottonwood tree that was barely surviving the drought, and they talked for 2 hours. What Marcella discovered over those 2 hours was both reassuring and complicated. Andrew Lockhart was real. His badge was real. His investigation was real. He had indeed been tracking Crane's land fraud operation for 6 months, had documented at least 9 cases of forced sales under duress, had identified 3 cases where landowners had died under suspicious circumstances, and had been in contact with the Austin commissioner for the past 2 months building the case for a federal warrant. What he needed, exactly as Marcella needed, was the private ledger. What he did not know, because he had come to this from the law enforcement angle rather than the personal one, was the specific location of the ledger within Crane's office, the details of the safe, or the fact that Crane had a second set of hired men who operated not in town but along the roads outside, whose job was to intercept anyone trying to leave redemption with information that might be dangerous to Crane's interests. This last detail Marcella knew because Pete Dalloway had told her, and it was the detail that had made her plan so carefully. "So you have the testimony from Dalloway," Andrew said, leaning forward on his elbows, watching her with those unsettling gray eyes that seemed to process everything she said on multiple levels simultaneously. "I have it in the ledger book in my carpet bag," she said, "and the fraudulent deed copies, also in the book, and you know the safe combination." She paused. "I have a reasonable hypothesis about it. Clara Hobbs watched Crane open it once and remembered a sequence. It may have changed." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "You plan to get into that office alone?" "Yes." "And out of this town alone with the ledger and with Crane's men on the roads?" "Yes." "Marcella." He said her name with a quality that was not pity and not condescension, but something more like recognition. One person who has spent too long doing dangerous things, alone acknowledging the same quality in another. That plan had a very low probability of survival. "Most of my plans do," she said, and she did not mean it as a joke, and he did not receive it as one. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet. It was too early and they were both too guarded for that, but something honest and mutual. The recognition of a shared understanding of what it meant to carry a serious thing through a dangerous world with no one at your back. "Tell me what you have," she said, "and I will tell you what I have, and then we figure out the rest together." He told her. She told him. The 2 hours stretched into 3, and by the time they walked back to town through the warm dusk, they had the beginning of something that was more than a plan. Over the next 2 days, Marcella watched Andrew Lockhart in action and found herself making a series of unwilling adjustments to the story she had constructed about who he was. She had expected a lawman with a lawman's rigidity, a man who would want to do things according to procedure and protocol, and who would see her unauthorized investigation and forged documents as problems to be managed rather than tools to be used. She had expected someone who would try to take over, who would see her role as subordinate by default, who would look at her the way most men in 1882 looked at a woman operating with this kind of autonomous intelligence. with unease and the persistent instinct to redirect her toward something less dangerous and less consequential. Andrew Lockhart was not that man. He deferred to her knowledge of the specific evidence, because she had assembled it and she knew it better than anyone. He asked questions that demonstrated he was genuinely processing what she told him rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she outlined a tactical approach to getting into the bank, he engaged with it seriously, identified 2 vulnerabilities she had missed, and contributed 2 improvements that made it significantly safer without fundamentally altering the strategy she had built. He also, without making a performance of it, began quietly making her life in redemption safer. He made it known that he was in town on official business. He had a conversation with Caleb Droot that apparently satisfied the deputy's concerns about the land registry matter sufficiently to buy them another week of unchallenged presence in town. He positioned himself, on the second evening, at the bar of the Silver Spur in such a way that Rooster and his companions found themselves making a wide berth around any situation that involved Marcella. He did all of this without being asked, and without expecting acknowledgement, which meant that when she noticed it and felt the warmth of it spreading somewhere beneath her sternum, she was completely unprepared. She was not supposed to be feeling warmth about anyone. She had not allowed herself that luxury in a very long time, and with very good reason. On the evening of the 3rd day, they sat in the small back room of the boarding house that Mrs. Agatha Turner ran with iron-fisted efficiency and considerable kindness, and they reviewed the final plan. Andrew had a hand-drawn layout of the bank's 2nd floor. Marcella had the safe sequence. They had timed the night watchman's rotation. They had identified the window from which access was most practical. They had a route out of town that bypassed the 2 most likely road positions of Crane's exterior men, running north through a dry wash to the rail junction at Wheeler, where they could take the morning train east before anyone in Redemption understood what had been taken. Friday night, Marcella said. Crane hosts a card game at the Spur every Friday. He is there until midnight at minimum. His men are there with him. The bank is emptiest then. Friday, Andrew agreed. He was looking at her plan notes spread across the table, and she was looking at him looking at them, and she became abruptly aware that she had been spending a considerable amount of time over the past 3 days looking at him, noticing things about him that had nothing to do with operational planning. The way he listened completely, with his whole body oriented toward whoever was speaking. The quality of stillness he had, a physical ease that was not laziness but more like deep reserves of self-possession, the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and had come to terms with it. The way he never spoke more words than a thing required, but when he did speak, what he said was worth hearing. And the way he looked at her, not the way most men looked at her, which was either with desire that she had learned to manage at arm's length, or with suspicion that she had learned to neutralize, but with something she could not fully categorize. Respect, yes. Intelligence, yes. But underneath, it's something warmer and more unguarded that appeared when he thought she was focused on something else and disappeared quickly when she looked up. She recognized it because she felt it herself, which was precisely why, on the 4th day, she tried to end it. She found him in the morning, when he was cleaning his Colt single-action Army revolver on the porch of the boarding house, and she sat down across from him and told him about her past. Not all of it, but enough. The father she had fled. The years between 16 and 20, moving from town to town, taking work where she could find it, surviving in ways that she was not proud of, and that had left marks she did not always know how to carry. The brief marriage at 19, to a man named David Park, who had seemed kind and had proved to be otherwise, and from whom she had eventually departed in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. The 2 years she had spent working as a clerk for a land attorney in Abilene, which was where she had first understood how the law worked and how it could be used, and where she had first begun to understand the machinery of what Virgil Crane was doing to the people around Redemption. She told him about Thomas Gaines, her mother's common-law husband, the man who was the closest thing to a father she had known since she fled her actual one, and how he had died, and how she had spent 8 months preparing to do something about it. She told him all of this not to explain herself but to warn him, to lay out the catalog of damage so that he could understand why she was not a safe investment. Why the woman he was looking at with that warm, careful attention was a woman who broke things, or who attracted breaking, who had a dark past that did not stay neatly in the past but followed her, and who had made herself into a tool for a specific purpose and had not left much room for anything else. "I am not worth the trouble," she said, and she said it clearly and without self-pity, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. "You need to understand that. Everything I touch either breaks or burns." And then he said it. The words that would anchor themselves in her memory and refuse to leave for the rest of her life, that she would repeat to herself on difficult days when she needed to remember that the world had more in it than she sometimes believed. "Trouble is all I have time for, Marcella." And then he told her his own story, because he owed her that. Andrew Lockhart had grown up in Kansas, on a farm outside Dodge City that his parents had worked from nothing into something decent. He had 3 younger siblings. He had been 20 when his father died of typhoid, and left the farm and the debt, and the 3 younger children in Andrew's care. He had spent 4 years trying to hold it together, and had ultimately lost the farm in 1873, when a combination of drought and a creditor who was not interested in extensions had forced him to sell at a loss that wiped out everything his parents had built. He had put his siblings with their aunt in Wichita, and had spent the following 3 years doing the kind of work a young man without land or money does in the West, driving cattle, working freight lines, spending a winter as a hired hand for a ranch outside Amarillo. He had briefly worn a badge as a town deputy in a small Kansas settlement that no longer existed, because the railroad had decided not to come through it after all, and it had simply deflated and disappeared. He had become a deputy U.S. Marshal at 27, because a federal marshal named Clarence Webb had seen something in him worth developing, and because the law, for all its limitations, had seemed like the most useful tool available for addressing the specific kind of wrong that he had watched happen to his family and to other families, and that he could not stop thinking about. "Land fraud," Marcella said. "Land fraud," he confirmed. "The thing that took the farm was not drought alone. My father had taken a loan through a land company in Wichita that had representations in its contract that were fraudulent. He did not know. I did not know until after, when I finally had someone look at the paperwork. By then there was nothing to be done. But I have never forgotten what it looked like. A family losing everything they had built because someone more powerful than them decided that the law and the truth were optional." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why I am here. And which is why, when you tell me you are not worth the trouble, what I hear is someone describing herself as though she were her circumstances rather than herself. And those are not the same thing." Marcella sat very still. The morning was bright and hot, and the dust was already rising at the end of the street, and somewhere a horse was complaining about something. "You are very certain about me for someone who has known me for 4 days, she said. "I am certain about what I see," Andrew said. "And I see a woman who has spent years doing something hard and right and largely thankless. That is not a woman who is not worth the trouble. That is a woman who does not believe she deserves anything on the other side of the trouble, which is a different problem." She did not answer him. She did not have an answer. She sat for a moment longer, and then she stood up and said they should go over the plan again, and he let her redirect, which was the right thing to do, and she filed everything he had said in the part of herself that she would not look at directly until later. Friday arrived with a red sunrise that the old-timers in Redemption regarded as an omen, though they disagreed about what it augured. The town was in its usual late afternoon lull by 6 o'clock, and by 8 the sounds of the weekly card game at the Silver Spur were drifting through the warm, dark air, the clatter of chips and the low wash of men's voices and the occasional bark of laughter. Marcella and Andrew approached the bank from the alley that ran behind the dry goods store, moving in the dark with the careful quiet of people who had planned this enough times that the movements had become automatic. Andrew had his Colt and a set of lock picks that he was impressively competent with, a skill he attributed with dry humor to a winter spent in the company of a very gifted safecracker who had thought he was converting Andrew to a life of crime rather than inadvertently training a lawman. The back window of the bank's upper floor was their entry point, accessed by the external staircase that served as a fire escape, and that Marcella had confirmed was both structurally sound and not visible from the main street. They went up it in single file, Andrew first, and when they reached the window he worked the lock in under 3 minutes and they slid inside into the warm darkness of Virgil Crane's office. It was a large room that smelled of cigar smoke and bay rum hair tonic, with a heavy desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 2 walls, and the safe in the corner behind a painting of a mountain landscape that was almost certainly more expensive than anything else in Redemption. Andrew lifted the painting aside. The safe was a Diebold, which was a high-quality lock, and the combination that Clara Hobbs had observed and passed to Marcella was right 32, left 15, right 7. Andrew worked it while Marcella held the small lantern with the shutter nearly closed, providing just enough light to see the dial. The third number clicked. The handle turned. Inside the safe were 3 stacks of paper currency that neither of them touched, a personal correspondence file that Andrew photographed mentally with the focused attention of a professional, and at the back, a dark green leather ledger bound in brass fittings. Andrew took the ledger. He opened it and held it in the sliver of lantern light, and Marcella leaned over his shoulder, and they both read what was on the first 2 pages. And even for 2 people who had been expecting something damning, what they saw was worse than anticipated. Names, dates, amounts paid, names of the hired men used for what were recorded with businesslike clarity as property persuasion services and road incident management. 8 names of landowners. Dates beside 3 of them that corresponded to deaths. The name Thomas Gaines, with a sum of money beside it and the initial of the man who had been paid. Marcella pressed her hand flat against the desk and breathed carefully and steadily for a count of 10. Andrew's hand came to rest on her shoulder for one brief, warm moment. No words, just the acknowledgement that what she was looking at was real and that it mattered and that she had not been wrong. She lifted her head. "Let us go." They went out the way they came in, window and staircase and alley. Andrew was replacing the window latch behind him when the sound reached them, boots on the far end of the alley, more than one pair moving with purpose. They had been seen, or followed, or someone had talked. The trap had been sprung. "Run," Andrew said very quietly. They ran. The alley debouched behind the feed store, and Marcella knew the route from there. 2 blocks north and then west through the gap between the Chandler and the Farrier, to the dry wash that would take them to the road north. She ran it from memory in the dark while behind them the sounds of pursuit organized and spread. More men, which meant Crane had been warned and had pulled people from the card game or had men positioned in advance. They made the gap between buildings and she heard a shot, wide and high. The kind of warning shot fired by a man who wanted to stop them rather than kill them, because Crane would want them alive for questioning about what they had found and who had been told. Andrew caught her arm as they reached the edge of the dry wash, and they went down the bank and into the wash bed together, running on the dry sand that muffled footsteps, and after 300 yards the sounds of pursuit faded. Crane's men did not know the wash. They kept moving for a mile until they were well outside the edge of town, and then they stopped behind a stand of mesquite and listened. Silence. Wind. The distant howl of something wild. "They will have men on the road by now," Marcella said, breathing hard. "Yes," Andrew said. He had his hand pressed to his left forearm and she saw the dark stain there. "You are hit. A graze from the shot. It is not serious." She looked at him in the darkness and he looked back, and the silence between them had a particular quality, the compressed aftermath of fear that has been held at bay and is now demanding acknowledgement. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then because it was the dark and they were alone and she was holding herself very carefully together, "Thank you. We still need to get to Wheeler." "I know. We go north through the wash for another 2 miles, then east on the ridge line. Crane's men will cover the main road. They may not cover the ridge. They may. Yes, they may." A choice in the dark, the kind that has no guaranteed answer, only the best available option in a bad set of options. "Ridge," Andrew said, and she agreed, and they moved. It took 3 hours to reach the rail junction at Wheeler. The ridge route was longer and harder terrain, and Andrew's arm, which he had insisted was merely a graze, was seeping steadily enough that Marcella tore strips from her petticoat and bound it properly during a brief stop, working by feel in the darkness with the efficiency of a woman who had field-dressed a wound before and knew it needed to be taken seriously even when the patient was minimizing. "You have done this before," Andrew said, watching her work. "Ranching accident, a man I worked for during one of the years when I was moving. His hired hand caught a barbed wire fence in a fall. Doctor was 2 towns away. You are remarkably competent. I am remarkably practical. There is a difference." He was quiet while she tied off the binding. Then, "Will you let me thank you? You thanked me 6 minutes ago." "I thanked you for the binding. I mean for all of it. For 8 months of work that most people would not have done. For refusing to let Thomas Gaines's death be just another thing that happened to just another person that no one important enough would bother to account for." She sat back on her heels in the scrub grass and looked at him in the faint starlight and felt the dangerous, forbidden luxury of being understood by another person. "He was kind to my mother," she said, "and to me when I visited. He did not ask her to be less than what she was, and he did not try to manage me. He just built things and tended things and treated people as though they mattered. And then a man who wanted his land had him killed on a road and wrote the sum he had paid in a ledger and filed it under business expenses." Her voice, which had been steady, thickened very slightly. "Someone ought to have stood up for him." "Yes," Andrew said, "they ought to." They reached Wheeler at 4 in the morning and found the small station closed but unlocked in the casual way of remote stations in 1882 that received few night travelers and had little of value. They waited on the platform bench in the thinning dark, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and Andrew dozed while Marcella kept watch with the green ledger in her carpetbag and everything they needed in the case he was carrying. The train arrived at 6:15 with the grinding drama that all steam locomotives arrived with in that era, noise and heat and the smell of coal smoke and oil, and they boarded the eastbound car and took seats in the rear. And when the train pulled out of Wheeler Station and the Texas Panhandle began rolling away behind them, Marcella felt the knot that had lived beneath her sternum for 8 months begin, very slowly and with considerable suspicion, to loosen. She glanced at Andrew. He had fallen fully asleep, his head tipped slightly to one side, the lines of tension around his eyes smoothed away, looking younger and less armored, just a man who was very tired after a very long night. She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended to. Then she looked away. They arrived in Amarillo that afternoon and checked into separate rooms at the Amarillo Commercial Hotel, which was a reasonable establishment with actual plumbing. And Marcella washed the dust and fear of the previous week off herself, and changed into clean clothes, and then sat at the small desk in her room with the Crane ledger open in front of her, and copied every significant entry into her own cipher notebook in her own hand, creating a backup of the most critical evidence in a form that would survive the loss of the ledger itself. Andrew went to the Amarillo telegraph office and sent a wire to Commissioner Vance in Austin, coded in a form they had agreed on prior to his departure, the language of a livestock deal consummated, which in the agreed code meant that primary evidence had been secured and required secure transport to the capital. Vance wired back within 4 hours. There would be a federal escort from Amarillo to Austin within 2 days. The warrant for Virgil Crane's arrest, which had been held in readiness pending this evidence, would be sworn within 24 hours of the ledger's arrival in the capital. They had done it. Marcella sat in the dining room of the commercial hotel that evening across from Andrew Lockhart, with a plate of food in front of her that she was actually eating rather than simply maintaining the appearance of eating, which was a distinction she was aware of because she had spent the past 2 weeks primarily doing the latter. "Vance will want your testimony," Andrew said, "and Dalloway's, if he is willing to travel. I will contact Dalloway. He has been nervous about visibility, but with a warrant issued and Crane actually in custody, he may feel safer about speaking openly. The trial will be public. Your name will come out." "I know," she ate for a moment. "I gave Caleb Drought a false story about a homestead claim. Drought is going to find his record somewhat cleared of confusion once Crane's operation is fully investigated," Andrew said, with the neutral tone of a man making a legal observation rather than endorsing fraud. "The land manipulation Crane did extended into some of the registry. It is a complicated situation. You are being diplomatic. I am being accurate. In a territory where the victim of the fraud and the perpetrator of a minor deception in pursuit of evidence are the same person, federal prosecutors tend to focus their attention on the 8 counts of land fraud, 3 cases of probable murder, and systemic corruption of local records rather than on the methods used by the investigator. You sound very certain about that. I have been doing this for 4 years. I have a sense of how federal prosecutors organize their priorities." A silence. The dining room was moderately full. Ranchers and traveling merchants, and 2 women who appeared to be in the millinery trade, based on the hat boxes stacked beside their table. The sounds of ordinary life moving at its ordinary pace, which felt surreal after the compressed urgency of the past week. "What do you do after Austin?" Marcella asked. He looked at her. The question had a quality to it that they both recognized, the question beneath the question. "That depends," he said. "On the case outcome." "Partly," he said. "Partly on other things." He held her gaze, and she held his, and the moment had the quality of a threshold, the particular suspended instant before a choice is made. "I have an invitation from the Amarillo Land Commission to consult on 3 pending fraud cases," she said, carefully. "Commissioner Vance mentioned that my work on the Crane file was exactly the kind of investigative assembly they have had difficulty finding people capable of. It would be paid work, legitimate work." "Amarillo," Andrew said. "For a start. The Austin field office has jurisdiction over the entire Southern Territory," Andrew said, matching her careful tone. "Field deputies are deployed according to case requirements, which means a deputy with particular expertise in land fraud patterns would logically be deployed to cases involving land fraud." "Logically," she agreed. "Cases that happen to be concentrated in and around Amarillo at the present time. What a coincidence. Remarkable." The ghost of a smile crossed her face, the first real smile, not the controlled, calibrated smile she deployed as a social tool, but the involuntary kind, the kind that happened because something inside her had decided to. It lasted only a moment and then retreated, but he had seen it, and the change in his expression in response to seeing it was something she filed away very carefully. 2 days later, the federal escort arrived in Amarillo, 2 deputy U.S. Marshals from the Austin office, a secured transport wagon, and a letter from Commissioner Vance that formally thanked both Andrew and Marcella for their contribution to what Vance described in careful official language as a matter of significant public interest. Virgil Crane was arrested in Redemption on a Thursday morning by a combined force of federal deputies and Texas Rangers, while he was in the middle of eating breakfast. Rooster and 2 other members of his hired team were arrested alongside him. Pete Dalloway agreed, once Marcella contacted him and explained that Crane was in federal custody, to provide full testimony. The trial was set for February of 1883 in Austin. Between August and February, Marcella worked for the Amarillo Land Commission, and Andrew worked the territory out of the Amarillo Field Deputy's office, which had been established in a modest building on the south end of the main street, and they were, for the first time in either of their lives, in the same place at the same time with enough breathing room to learn each other at something other than crisis pace. It was different from the urgent closeness of redemption. Slower, more exposed. Without the forward momentum of danger keeping them both oriented toward an external purpose, they had to navigate the unfamiliar territory of simply being two people who were drawn to each other and learning what that meant. Andrew was methodical in everything, including this. He appeared at her office at the Land Commission on a Tuesday morning with coffee from the establishment 2 doors down that made it well, and he set a cup on her desk and said he had an hour before he was due in court to testify in a related matter, and would she walk with him. She walked with him. They talked about the case files she was reviewing and the cases he was working, and gradually, naturally, about other things. About what Kansas had looked like in autumn before the drought years. About the book she had found in the hotel lending library, an 1876 novel by Henry James that she had complicated feelings about. About the brother and 2 sisters he still wrote to in Wichita, who were grown now and doing well, about whom he spoke with a quiet warmth that made her chest ache. She was aware of falling in love the way you are aware of warmth after a very long time in the cold, first as an absence of absence, then as a presence that becomes undeniable. She resisted it, or rather, she continued to have the conversation with herself about why she should resist it, because the reasons were still real even if they had lost some of their urgency. Her dark past was still her past. The damage done to her at 15, and at 19, and in the years between, was still carried in her body, and in the reflexive guardedness that she could not entirely remove from herself even when she wanted to. She was still a woman who had survived by being harder than her circumstances, and she was not entirely sure what she was without that hardness as her primary tool. Andrew, to his considerable credit, never asked her to lay it down. He simply operated in a way that made the hardness less necessary, consistently and without fanfare. The way a man who understands that a burned field needs time before it becomes fertile again, does not try to force the growth, but keeps the conditions right. In September, he kissed her for the first time, on the wooden sidewalk outside the Land Commission office at the end of an evening when they had been reviewing documents late into the dusk, and had walked out into the cooler air of night together. It was not preceded by a dramatic declaration. He simply stopped walking and she stopped because he had, and he looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention that she had come to understand as one of the most fundamental things about him. And he said, "May I?" And she said, "Yes," and he kissed her with the same quality of care that he applied to everything, completely present, unhurried, and entirely genuine. She stood very still for a moment afterward, and then she put her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there on the sidewalk in the dark while the town moved around them, and something in her that had been clenched for a very long time let go. "I am afraid," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said, "not of you. I know," he said again, "of wanting something and losing it." "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "So am I. That is not a reason not to try." October arrived cool and wet, the drought breaking dramatically with 3 weeks of rain that turned the brown Panhandle landscape briefly and startlingly green. Marcella moved from the hotel into a small rented house on the edge of town, with a porch and a kitchen garden that she started with the optimism of a person who has decided to stay somewhere. And she began to understand that this decision, the decision to stay somewhere, was the most significant thing she had done in years. She testified in Austin in February 1883, presenting the evidence she had assembled over 8 months with the organized precision of someone who had spent a long time learning the law from the practitioner's side, and had developed a presentation style that 3 different reporters in the courtroom described afterward as remarkably persuasive. Andrew testified as well, covering the law enforcement dimension of the investigation and the chain of custody of the Crane ledger. Pete Dalloway testified for 2 days and was visibly frightened throughout, but held every detail steady, which was the bravery of an ordinary man doing an extraordinary thing in a system that did not always reward it. Virgil Crane was convicted on 6 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of falsification of official records. He received 22 years in the federal penitentiary. Rooster and 2 of the other hired men received sentences of 8 and 5 years respectively. The fraudulent deeds that Crane had registered were voided. The properties affected were restored to their rightful owners or their heirs where owners had died. There was no heir to restore Thomas Gaines's land to, since Marcella Reed had died before him, and Marcella was not legally his daughter. But the Texas Land Commission, in recognition of the role she had played in exposing the fraud and as a mechanism for dealing with the restored property, offered her a formal consultancy position and offered the Gaines land as a purchased property at the assessed fair value, which with the consultancy fee and what she had saved from 8 months of paid work, she could now afford. She bought the land. She stood on the northeast corner of Thomas Gaines's 400 acres of Texas prairie on a morning in April 1883, with the spring grass coming in knee-high, and the sky, the particular infinite blue of the West at its best. And she thought about Thomas Gaines, who had built something real here and who deserved better than what had happened to him. And she thought about Marcella Reed, who had come to this land hoping for something she had half found before it was taken from her. And she thought about herself. She thought about what she wanted. Andrew found her there, as she had known he would when she told him where she was going that morning. He rode out on the gray mare he used for field work and tied her at the fence post Gaines had built in 1878 and walked through the spring grass to where Marcella stood, and he stood beside her looking out at the land. "It is beautiful," he said. "Yes. What are you thinking?" She turned to look at him. He was squinting slightly in the morning light, his hat casting a shadow across his jaw, and she knew him well enough now to read the things he kept quiet, the careful hope that was present in the way he held himself, the patience of a man who had decided that whatever she decided, he would accept. "I am thinking about what Thomas would have done with this land," she said. He talked about a cattle operation, not large, maybe 200 head with horses. He understood horses. "That is a significant undertaking for one person." "I know," she said, and then, "Andrew, Marcella, I am still who I am. The dark past does not go away because the present is better." "I know who you are," he said. "I have been watching you for 10 months. I know who you are. I am difficult. Yes. I have habits from years of surviving alone that will not disappear quickly. I will sometimes default to handling things by myself when I should ask for help. I will sometimes be difficult to reach when I feel afraid." "Also, yes," he said. "And I am stubborn about procedure in ways that will frustrate you. I am the kind of man who fixes things that are broken rather than replacing them, which extends metaphorically to situations and sometimes to arguments. I do not always say what I am feeling in a timely manner. I am told I am relentlessly optimistic in ways that can be irritating when optimism is not the appropriate response." She was quiet for a moment. "Who told you that?" "My sister Ruth. She is the candid one." Marcella felt the smile come again, the real one, the involuntary one. She looked out over the land for a moment more and then she looked at him and said, "I want to stay. I want to build something here. And I want to do it with you if that is something you want." "I have wanted nothing else for approximately 8 months, Andrew said, with a dryness that covered something much more exposed. She stepped toward him and he put his arms around her and the spring wind came across the prairie with the smell of new grass and distant rain, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his hand come up to rest against her hair, and she breathed. "We will need to build a house," she said. "Yes. The existing structure is salvageable but too small. We can add on. I have some specific ideas about the kitchen. Tell me." So she told him, and he listened. And they stood in the spring grass of Thomas Gaines's 400 acres and talked about building something. And the conversation was, without either of them having a ceremony or a formal declaration at that particular moment, the beginning of a shared life. Andrew proposed formally in June, on a Saturday evening on the porch of the small house they were living in while the larger one was being built, with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that his father had given her on their wedding day in 1851 in a farmhouse in Kansas, and that his sister Ruth had kept in a box for him for 3 years after his mother died, waiting for a moment when it would be the right ring for the right person. He told her the story of the ring before he offered it, and she listened, and when he finished, she said yes without making him wait any longer, because he had earned a great many things from her, including the gift of not being made to wait for something he had already shown beyond any reasonable doubt that he would honor. They were married on a Saturday in August of 1883 in the small church on the east end of Amarillo that was run by a minister named Reverend Cole, who had a booming voice and conducted ceremonies with genuine feeling. Andrew's sister Ruth came from Wichita, and his brother James, and his other sister Helen, and they were warm, direct, genuinely curious people who met Marcella with open eyes and no apparent agenda, which was the best greeting she could have asked for. Ruth, in particular, attached herself to Marcella immediately with a frankness that was simultaneously disarming and refreshing. She said on their first meeting that she had been telling Andrew for years that he was going to meet someone remarkable in the most inconvenient possible circumstances, and that a woman who had conducted an independent investigation into land fraud and broken into a corrupt businessman's office safe, while simultaneously navigating the romantic attentions of an extremely stubborn deputy marshal, was perhaps the most inconvenient possible circumstance she could have imagined. And she was entirely satisfied. Marcella, who had not had anything resembling a sister in her life, found herself enormously fond of Ruth Lockhart within approximately 48 hours, which was both unexpected and welcome. The wedding was small by the standards of some, but felt large to Marcella, who had spent years either alone or in the company of people she had to maintain careful distance from. Commissioner Vance sent a telegram. Caleb Droot from Redemption, who had been kept apprised of the case outcomes and had apparently made his peace with the land registry confusion, sent a cordial letter. Pete Dalloway, who had relocated to Amarillo after the trial and was working at a printing house, attended in person and shook both their hands with the specific emotion of a man who understands that he is standing at a happy outcome of a very bad situation. They danced in the small cleared space beside the church in the late afternoon light, and Marcella danced with Andrew in the way of two people who have learned each other thoroughly and are not performing anything for an audience, just moving together, warm and steady and present. The house was finished by October, a proper frame house with 4 rooms and the kitchen Marcella had designed, and a covered porch along the front and south sides, looking out over the prairie. They had contracted with a local builder named Hector Avila, who did meticulous work and asked good questions about what they wanted the space to do, and the result was a house that felt from the first day like a place where actual life was meant to happen. They brought cattle in the spring of 1884, a herd of 212 longhorns from a rancher near Tascosa who was reducing his operation, and hired 2 ranch hands, a weathered former trail driver named Roy who knew cattle the way musicians know their instrument, and a younger man named Samuel who was 23 and serious about learning the work and willing to be taught. Andrew applied for a transfer of his deputy's posting to the Amarillo field office on a permanent basis, which was granted, a decision that allowed him to work the territory while maintaining the ranch as his primary address. It was a full life, a genuinely, unexpectedly full life. Marcella continued her consultancy work for the Land Commission through 1884 and into 1885, and became known in the territory as a reliable, sharp-eyed examiner of contested property claims, someone who could spot a fraudulent deed at a distance, and who testified in court with a precision that judges appreciated and opposing counsel did not enjoy. She was not the first woman to do this kind of work in Texas, but she was among the first in the Panhandle, and she navigated the particular friction that came with that with the equanimity of someone who had been navigating friction her entire life. In March of 1885, she and Andrew learned they were expecting a child. The news arrived at a moment when they were both at the kitchen table reviewing respective case files, which was a domestic image so ordinary and so different from what either of their lives had looked like 3 years prior that they both sat for a moment simply experiencing it. Andrew put down his papers and looked at her across the table with an expression that had no calculation in it at all, only the pure, uncomplicated feeling of a man whose capacity for joy had not been diminished by the difficult things he had lived through. "A child," he said. "In October, the doctor estimates," she said. She watched him carefully, the old habit of watching to understand what was real versus what was performed, and found nothing but what was on the surface. "How do you feel?" He got up from the table and came around it and sat next to her and took her hands in his, and she let him. And he said, "I feel as though I am the luckiest man who has had the great good fortune to be born into troubled times, because troubled times sent him in the direction of the most remarkable woman in the Texas Panhandle." She pressed her lips together against the feeling that came with this, the particular vulnerability of being loved clearly by someone and believing it. "That is an elaborate way to say you are happy." "I am happy," he said simply. "Are you?" She was. She was fully aware that she had been for some time, had been cataloging the evidence of her own happiness with the same careful attention she applied to evidence in her professional work, noting it and verifying it and finding it consistent and real. "Yes," she said, "I am." Their son was born in October 1885, the first week of the month, in the house on Thomas Gaines's land, attended by a midwife named Mrs. Clara Booth, who was experienced and calm, and who managed the long labor with the practical efficiency that Marcella appreciated as a fellow woman who organized the world primarily through competence. The boy was healthy and loud and had Andrew's gray eyes, visible from the first hours. They named him Thomas Reed Lockhart, for the man who had deserved better, and it felt like a correct thing, like the closing of a wound that had been kept open for too long. Andrew held his son the evening of his birth with the expression of a man, encountering something his words were not large enough for. He sat in the chair beside the bed in the lamplight and held the small, warm weight of the boy and looked at Marcella, who was exhausted and disheveled and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and said, "Thank you." She reached out and put her hand on his arm on the spot where the bullet graze had healed into a thin scar and said, "Thank you for not walking away." "I never had the option," he said, and smiled, and the smile was the truth. Thomas grew through the winter into a baby of considerable personality and strong opinions, and through the spring of 1886 into an early walker who regarded the ranch with the proprietary interest of someone planning to own it eventually, which made Roy, the ranch hand, extremely entertained. He had his mother's focused attention and his father's physical steadiness, and a temperament that was entirely his own. Ruth Lockhart visited in the spring of 1886 and spent 6 weeks, which became her annual habit, and she and Marcella settled into the kind of friendship that had the particular warmth of being chosen as much as found. Andrew's brother James had married a woman named Clara who worked in a pharmacy in Wichita, and who corresponded with Marcella on matters of chemistry that intersected with the land analysis work. And these connections, real and maintained and growing, formed the architecture of a life that was genuinely inhabited rather than survived. In late 1886, Andrew was offered a promotion to senior deputy marshal with supervisory authority over the Amarillo district, which would have required him to travel considerably more and spend more time in Austin managing administrative functions. He and Marcella had a serious conversation about it over 2 evenings, and he turned it down, not because she asked him to, but because he did not want it, which was the correct reason, and she made sure she said so, that she would not have wanted him to forego something he genuinely wished for, and he believed her because she was a woman who meant what she said. He remained a field deputy, working the territory he knew, and the work suited him, and he was good at it, and he came home from it, which was the most important part. In 1887, the Texas Land Commission offered Marcella a staff position rather than a consultancy, which would make her a permanent employee of the state rather than an independent contractor, a distinction that had real significance in terms of both pay and standing, and the kind of cases she would have access to. She took it, and Commissioner Vance, who had by now met her in person twice and corresponded with her for nearly 5 years, wrote a letter saying that the commission was getting considerably the better end of the arrangement. She was 31 years old, and she had a title and a salary and a husband and a son and a house and 400 acres of prairie that was running 240 cattle, and she stood on the porch one evening in the summer of 1887 and watched the light change over the grassland and tried to locate, somewhere inside herself, the woman who had ridden into redemption 5 years ago with a forged letter and a stolen horse and a head full of fear and purpose and nothing else. She could find her. She was still there, but she was no longer the whole of what Marcella was. She was the foundation, the part that had built the survival skills and the sharp intelligence and the refusal to accept injustice, and all of those things were still true and still valuable, but they were now contained in a life rather than constituting a life, and the difference between those two things was enormous. Andrew came out onto the porch and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad I stayed," she said. A pause. "In redemption, in general, I spent many years not staying anywhere. Staying is better." He kissed the top of her head, and they stood in the evening light, and the summer air moved over the grass, and the cattle were distant shapes at the water tank. And inside the house, they could hear Thomas, 2 years old and talking constantly now, narrating something to his toy horse in the complicated language of small children, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world. Their daughter was born in early 1889, and they named her Eleanor after Marcella's mother, and she came into the world with the emphatic announcement of a person who has strong views about her arrival, which remained consistent with her personality as she grew. She had Marcella's dark hair and dark eyes, and an expression of focused assessment in her infant face that Andrew said was unmistakably her mother's. Thomas, 3 years old and an established authority on life at the ranch, regarded his sister with thoughtful skepticism that gradually resolved into a protective attachment that would remain characteristic of their relationship. By summer, he was placing himself between Eleanor's basket and anything he considered a potential hazard, which included the dog, the chickens, visiting strangers, and loud sounds, and Roy said he was going to be formidable, and was not wrong. The territory changed around them through these years, as all territories change. The cattle industry had its cycles of boom and hardship. The railroads extended and reorganized. More settlers came, and the frontier that had characterized the Texas Panhandle in 1882 became something somewhat more settled, somewhat more connected to the institutional structures of a country that was gradually building itself into something more complex. The land fraud cases that had defined Marcella's early years with the commission became, as fraudulent schemes tend to do, more sophisticated rather than less common. But the machinery for addressing them had also improved, partly because of cases like the Crane prosecution, which had established precedents and created documentation that made subsequent cases cleaner. Marcella trained 2 younger investigators who came into the commission's employment in 1889 and 1890, and she was a serious and demanding teacher who also made sure that the people she trained understood not just the mechanics but the stakes, the real human cost of the paper crimes they were investigating. Andrew's case work shifted with the territory. The specific pattern of violent land fraud that had been Crane's method became rarer as its legal consequences became more clearly established. The crimes that occupied his work in the latter years of the decade were different in character: smuggling operations, horse theft at scale, and the persistent problem of jurisdictional complexity in a territory that was administered through overlapping layers of federal and state authority. He was good at the jurisdictional complexity work, good at the patient accumulation of evidence and the building of cases that held under scrutiny, and he found it satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when it is the right work for the person doing it. They had built something real, both of them together, from the wreckage of things that had not worked and the effort of people who had decided that trying was worth the inevitable uncertainty. On a Saturday evening in the summer of 1890, when Thomas was nearly 5 and Alina was a year and a half and walking with the reckless confidence of a very small person convinced of her own invincibility, Andrew and Marcella sat on the porch after supper in the last hour of light, and he said, "Do you remember what you told me in Redemption, on the morning you decided to warn me away? I told you I was not worth the trouble." "Yes." He turned to look at her. "You told me trouble was all you had time for." "True then," he said. "Still true, though the trouble has taken a very pleasant form." She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say a true thing. She usually said it. "I was wrong," she said, "about the trouble, about not being worth it." She held his gaze steadily. "I believed it. I believed it entirely, and I had evidence that I thought supported it, but I was wrong." "You were using incomplete evidence," he said. "Incomplete evidence was always your professional weakness." "My professional weakness is that I am stubborn and sometimes difficult and assume I know more than the other person in the room." "That is your style. Your weakness is incomplete evidence." She smiled. The real smile, wide and unguarded, the one that still appeared when something surprised her into it. "Fine. Incomplete evidence. The complete evidence suggests," he said, "that you are worth considerably more than the trouble, which is a high bar given that I find the trouble entirely worthwhile." "That is an extremely convoluted compliment. It is an accurate one." She reached across and took his hand, and he held it, and the evening came down over the prairie, slow and gold and warm, and the crickets started up in the grass. And inside the house Thomas was asking Roy something in his serious, precise way, and Alina had already been put to bed and was presumably constructing plans for the morning. They sat in the last of the light and held hands, and neither of them spoke for a while, because there are moments that do not require words, that are simply the fullness of a thing accumulated over time, and this was one of those. Marcella thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the woman who had ridden into Redemption in June of 1882 with a stolen horse and a forged letter, and a purpose that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with justice. And she thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had to have aligned exactly as they did for her to arrive at this porch, this evening, this life. The justice had happened. It had been incomplete, as justice always is, but Virgil Crane had served his sentence and the land was restored, and Thomas Gaines's death had been acknowledged and answered for, and Pete Dalloway slept easier, and Caleb Droot had eventually become a real sheriff with a proper commission, and things that had been broken had been, to the extent possible, repaired. And the love had happened too, which was the part she had not planned for, which was the part that had arrived as a kind of grace in the middle of a plan that had no room for it, and which had turned out to be the most consequential thing of all. She was 34 years old in 1890, and she had a full life, and she was building something on Thomas Gaines's 400 acres that would outlast her, and she was doing the work that was right for her, and she had a man beside her who had looked at her in the middle of a dark past and a dangerous present and seen not the damage but the person, and had said plainly and without condition, "I am not going anywhere." She had not been worth the trouble. She had been entirely wrong about that. But she had needed someone to show her, patiently and persistently and without retreating, that the evidence supported a different conclusion. The following spring, in March of 1891, Marcella discovered she was expecting again, their third child, and Andrew received the news with the same uncomplicated happiness he had brought to the previous 2 times, and she said, "You are consistently enthusiastic about this." And he said, "I am consistently enthusiastic about you, which is related." And she told him he was impossible and kissed him, which was a perfectly satisfactory resolution to the conversation. Their second son arrived in September 1891, healthy and loud in the family tradition, and they named him James for Andrew's brother, who was touched and made the journey from Wichita with his wife Clara to meet the baby and stay for 2 weeks of the kind of family life that had expanded steadily from the quiet, careful beginning of a marriage between 2 people who were not entirely sure they deserved happiness, and had discovered that the question of deserving was less important than the decision to build it. Thomas, at 6, took to his second younger sibling with the experienced authority of an eldest child who has navigated this before and has worked out a system. Eleanor, 2½, was fascinated by the baby in the specific way of children who have recently been the smallest person in a household and are adjusting to no longer holding that position. She was adaptable, and she adapted, and she named the baby something unpronounceable for approximately 1 month before settling on James, which was after all his actual name. The years moved as good years do, with the particular speed of time that is fully lived rather than merely endured. Marcella and Andrew worked and raised their children and managed the ranch and built the connections with their community that gave life its texture and density, the friendships with neighbors, the relationships with the church and the school, and the various small institutions of a town that had grown from a dusty outpost to a real place. Caleb Droot did visit, in the fall of 1892, when he was passing through Amarillo on official business from Redemption. He sat on their porch and drank coffee, and told them that the town had put in a proper telegraph line and was getting a new schoolhouse, and that there was a rumor the railroad might come through after all, and that Rooster, whose real name had turned out to be Charles O'Brien, had served his 8 years and had moved to Albuquerque and apparently opened a cooperage, which everyone found unlikely but no one could disprove. He looked around the ranch with the appreciation of a man who has known a situation from its complicated beginning and sees the good outcome, and he said that it was a fine thing, and Marcella agreed with him, and Andrew poured him more coffee, and they sat in the autumn afternoon and talked about nothing in particular, which is the particular luxury of lives that have resolved their most urgent conflicts and can afford to sit still. Pete Dalloway married in 1893, a woman named Josephine who worked at the printing house with him, and they sent an announcement that Marcella pinned on the kitchen wall next to a letter from Commissioner Vance announcing his retirement and the appointment of a new commissioner, who Vance described as capable and committed, high praise from a man who did not expend compliments carelessly. Andrew's father's farm in Kansas was now owned by a family named Breckenridge who had bought it 20 years before and were still working it. And Andrew had ridden through the county once on a case that took him north, and had seen the house from the road, still standing, with new paint on the barn, and had felt the particular settled emotion of a man who has made his peace with a wound and can look at the place where it happened without it reopening. He told Marcella about it on the evening he returned, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas doing homework at one end and Eleanor drawing at the other end, baby James asleep upstairs, and the house smelling of supper and the lamp burning warm, and he said, "It looked well tended," and she heard everything he meant by this and said, "Good," and reached across the table and touched his hand, and Thomas looked up from his arithmetic and said, "Are you all right, Pa?" in the grave, attentive way of a 6-year-old who monitors the emotional weather of his household, and Andrew said, "Better than all right," and smiled at his son, and the boy went back to his arithmetic satisfied. In 1895, Marcella published a monograph through the Texas Land Commission titled Patterns and Methods in Fraudulent Land Transfer, a practical guide for registry officers, which drew on 13 years of her investigative work and was formally adopted as a training document by the Texas Land Commission and subsequently by land offices in 3 other states. It was the most professionally satisfying thing she had accomplished outside of the Crane prosecution, and Andrew framed the title page and hung it in the hallway of the house, where it remained for the rest of their lives. She was 39 years old, and the land she stood on had been restored from fraud and was producing, and the children were growing into specific and interesting people, and the man she had tried to warn away 12 years earlier was still precisely who she had understood him to be in those first days in redemption, consistent and warm and honest, and entirely capable of patience, without making patience into martyrdom. On the evening after the publication was confirmed, they walked out after supper, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with Roy, who had stayed on all these years and was now more family than employee. And they walked to the northeast corner of the property where she had stood the first morning she came out to look at what she had bought, the corner where she had let herself think about what Thomas Gaines would have done with this land. The grass was high and the evening was gentle, and the cattle were settled for the night, and the sky was beginning to fill with the particular density of stars visible in the Panhandle, where the light pollution of cities was still a distant rumor. "We have done well," Andrew said. She thought about how to answer this correctly, how to hold the full scope of it. They had done well. They had done more than well. They had taken the raw material of 2 separate damaged lives and the improbable alignment of a land fraud case and a federal investigation, and a moment in a saloon when a man with a bullet graze had said something exactly right, and had built from all of that something that was real and lasting and genuinely good. "We have," she agreed. "Are you happy?" He asked the same question he had asked her on the porch the spring Thomas was born, and she gave him the same answer she had given then, because it was still true and if anything more so. "Yes," she said, "I am." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood on the northeast corner of 400 acres of Texas prairie in the summer of 1895. In the last golden decade of the century that had made the West what it was, and was already beginning to make it into something else, and they looked at what they had built. The trouble that had seemed once like something that would consume her entirely had turned out to be the path. The dark past had not disappeared, but it had been incorporated into something larger, something that had taken all the skills she had developed surviving it and put them to use for things that mattered. The hidden motives she had carried into redemption had resolved themselves into a life that had no need for hidden things, because there was nothing left to hide from, and more importantly, because there was someone beside her for whom she did not need to. She had told him she was not worth the trouble. He had said trouble was all he had time for, and in the 12 years since that night in the Silver Spur Saloon, they had together made the most of every bit of it. She tilted her head up and kissed him in the evening light, and he kissed her back with the same quality of attention he had always brought to everything that mattered to him, completely present and completely genuine. And the stars came out one by one over the Texas Panhandle, and the ranch was quiet. And inside the house, the children were moving through the warm, lit rooms of a home that had been built by people who decided, against considerable evidence, that the world would not cooperate, to try. And the world, in its complicated and imperfect and sometimes extraordinary way, had cooperated after all.